SQL Server Reporting Services Management and Deployment. In this nugget, we'll cover the concepts that you need to understand to perform management of your report server. We'll start with the basics to make sure that your IIS web server is up and running and configured properly. We'll talk about accessing that report server. There's two URLs. One is going to show you the management. The other is just going to give you a list of the different reports that have been deployed. We have different access levels that we need to cover. There's just general access level to the report server itself, and then there's access levels to reports and then the various items. We'll cover authentication, and there's several predefined roles that are already created for us. So you can enable that role for either a user or a group. I'll show you how to deploy your reports. We have our Business Intelligence Development Studio, and we also have Web Services, which has been around since Reporting Services 2005. You can allow end users to dynamically create reports, and to do that you're going to have to create a report model. And within that model you're going to define a data set. Now, to make your report server scale, sometimes you'll want to have a report server web farm. A web farm is just two or more report servers tapping into the same report server database for scalability. We'll talk about the concepts involving that, and then we'll also talk about key management. Key management is used in case you need to recover your report server instance in case something went wrong. We have options to create the key, and then of course we have the option to restore the key. Well, let's get started with our report server configuration. In our two previous nuggets, we used the Business Intelligence Development Studio to develop our reports, but we haven't actually published anything, and I do want to show you in this nugget how to not only publish but also how to set up your report server with the correct configurations. There's more than one way to connect to report services besides the Business Intelligence Development Studio. What we're looking at right now are administrative tools. Make sure that you have your Internet Information Services or ISS Manager. You'll find that under your Control Panel, then Administrative Tools. So if we double click on that, you'll see that we have our configuration page. I'm going to bring this over here. And the name of my server is Julie1. And if we double click on this or just expand it, you'll see that we have our different sites. So out of the box we have the default website. You'll have a port number right here. Out of the box the default is port 80. I have mine set to a different port because I already had something running on port 80. So let me show you how to configure this. You can simply highlight your default website, and then you're going to click on Bindings, and this is where you can modify this information. So just hit Edit, and this is where you can change the port if you need to. Hit OK. Now, one of the things you can do to test this is simply open up your Windows Explorer, and the default directory is going to be under the inet pub directory and then www root. And what I like to do is put a file in there called default.htm. And I just usually put just a one-liner in there. In my case, I'm going to open this up with Notepad. I just put a hello world in there. And the way that we find out that this is actually working is that we open up a web browser, and so we open up our local host :8079. Now if you're running on port 80 you don't have to put the port number since it's the default port number, and then just hit enter and you should see hello world. Now default.htm is that magic file that gets detected when it's sitting in that folder, so we know that this website is working just fine. Now the next thing, I want to make sure that my services are up and running just fine, so I'm going to go to my services, which is under Administrative Tools, and of course we want to make sure that our SQL Server services are running. Make sure the reporting services is running. I just have all of my SQL Server services running, doesn't hurt. Of course, if they're not running, just double click on them and hit the Start button. And then you'll want to go to your menu here and go to your Reporting Services Configuration Manager. And it's going to launch something that looks like this. It will ask you to connect to report server instance. So here you type in your server name and then your report server instance. I only have one choice here in the drop-down. We hit connect, and this is where you perform the configuration. So the first thing that I like to do is just kind of work my way down. I pay attention to the report server status. It looks like it's running. It's started. And then we go to service account, and I'm going to use the built-in local system account. I hit the web service URL, and right here I have my server name, port number, and then report server. Now in your case it will probably just be port 80. Once again, if you need to change any of this, you can just change the ports right here and then hit apply, and you'll see the changes. Okay, so just to test that this is working, let's just open up a web browser and we'll go to our local host, or we can say the actual name of the server, and then we'll say report server like that, and you should see a quick little listing like that. There's nothing in my list here, but at least we don't get an error message. Okay, so we can minimize that now. Now the next thing we're going to do is click on database. This is the SQL Server name of the report server database. Okay, so my database name is report server. I can go in here and change that. In fact, I might have several report server databases with different names. I'm sticking with the defaults. And then you can scroll down a little bit, and here are the report server database credentials. So I'm actually logging in with the local system. If you want to change the credentials, you can always hit the change credentials button and make your modifications. If you want to test your connection, that's also a good idea. And that looks great. I'll go ahead and hit cancel since I didn't really make any changes. Next, I go to my report manager URL. So once again, make sure that you have the same port that you set up with your IIS. Now, if you click on this link right here, you might get an error that looks something like that. Just ignore it. What I want you to do instead is take that URL and type it in the browser, just like we did a minute ago. So just take that right here and just change that to be reports. And this is what you should see. What I'd like to focus on right now are security settings for regular users. Keep in mind that right now we're logged in as the administrator, therefore we can do anything pretty much with what we want with the reporting services. So what I'm going to do is focus on this user called Bob. So what we have right here are our different user accounts on the operating system level. And you'll see here that we've got Bob, who's just a standard user, password protected. So what I'd like to do first of all is talk about security settings for the report server as a whole. Make sure that you click on Home, and then you can click on Site Settings, then on Security, and this is where we can configure security for the report server as a whole. So out of the box we have built-in administrators, and we're just saying that the administrators have the system administrator role assigned to them. We can click on New Role Assignment, and here you can either type in a group or a username. In this case, I'm just going to type in a username. So the name of my server domain is Julie1, and then I'm going to type in Bob. And then I can either make him the system administrator, which gives him very special privileges. He can pretty much do anything he wants to, or just a system user, so he can view the system properties and shared schedules. I'm going to make this a little bit more restrictive and assign system user to him. Then I click OK. So once again, those are the security settings for the report server as a whole. Now, let's talk about accessing particular reports. If I go back to Home right here, so we don't have any objects in here right now, but we will in a few minutes. And think of security as far as the objects as being a parent-child relationship. So at the top of our hierarchy, if we give somebody a particular role, that role will be applied down the tree unless, of course, we override it. Okay, so what we're going to do here is under Properties, we can give a new role assignment. And you'll see here that these different roles are different from what we were creating earlier. We have 5 different out-of-the-box roles. We have the browser role, which is the most restrictive. They can view folders, reports, and subscribe to reports. We have the content manager, which can manage content in there, so they can manage folders, reports, and resources. We have the My Reports role, which can publish reports and link reports and so on. We have Publisher role, as well as the Report Builder role, which allows users to view report definitions. So I'm going to go in here and assign Bob a role here. I'm going to allow Bob the browser role, and then I'll hit OK. So you can add as many roles in there as you want. In fact, you can create new roles if you want to. As I mentioned, we don't really have anything yet as far as reports in this area, but I want to show you how to do that. Okay, so I'm going to bring over my Business Intelligence Development Studio, and we're going to open up one of our projects. Let's open up our Cube SSRS project that we created earlier. And what we'd like to do here is first of all make sure that our properties are set correctly for deploying. So I can just right click here on my project and click on Properties. And under the target server URL, you want to make sure that this is set properly. So I have localhost 8079/report server. Yours might be different depending on your port number. I hit OK. And now I'm going to click on Build and then Deploy. So we take a look at our little status icon down below. It will tell us in a minute. Okay, there we go. Deploy succeeded. So now we can go back to this page here, and I'm just going to hit refresh. And you'll see now that we have our Cube SSRS project. I'm going to click on here. And you'll see that we have 3 different reports. That maps onto the 3 different reports that were created right down here. We can click on one of them, and there we have it. And the end user will actually be able to export this report into different formats. So if I want to, for example, export this as a comma-separated file, then I can just do that and then click on Export, and it's prompting me to save it or open it up. I'm just going to hit Cancel for right now. The other thing you should notice is that we have different tabs up here. I can click on Properties and modify the properties for this particular report. Now once again, remember that I'm logged in as the administrator. So if I'm logged in as somebody with lesser privileges, such as Bob, he's not going to see all these different options. I can click on Security here and specify the security that applies to this report only. So I could go in here and make any modifications by clicking on Edit Item Security. We also have History. And then we also have subscriptions right here. Now we don't have any subscriptions right now, but keep in mind that if we're logged in as Bob does have the privilege to create his own subscriptions, and he would see this menu down here. I'm going to log on now as Bob, just so you can see what his view is like with the different permission settings. One thing to notice when you try to either create a new snapshot or create a new subscription is that you might get an error message that looks like this. It will say, for example, report history can't be created because the credentials are not stored credentials. So I'll show you now how to modify your credentials so that they're stored to enable snapshots and subscriptions. Okay, so just go to your home and then hone in on the report items, such as here, product line by year. And under Properties, you'll see that we have our data sources area right here. Right now this is configured as a shared data source. We actually want this to be a custom data source. What type of data source is it? Well, it's SQL Server. You need to put in a connection string. You can obtain your connection string actually by going into the Business Intelligence Development Studio and drilling down to your data source and seeing what that data source says. So I just went ahead and copied it from there. So data source equals, and then the domain followed by a semicolon, initial catalog equals, and the database name. Okay, so then connect using. This is what you want to select: credentials stored securely in the report server. So who are you going to be logged in as to connect to the data source? Once again, you can get this from your Business Intelligence Development Studio. In my case, it happens to be my host name followed by the user, and then of course the password. Now these are Windows credentials, so I'm going to check that. If the username and password actually happen to be SQL Server credentials instead of Windows credentials, then I would uncheck that box right there. At this point, we can click on Apply, and now we can go to our history here, and you'll see that when we try to create a new snapshot, that we get this right here. So it immediately created a snapshot with the timestamp. So in other words, this is what your data looks like frozen at this point in time. You can create as many new snapshots as you want to. If I create another one, you'll see that they're slightly different in time here. And of course, you can always select a snapshot and delete it if you want to. Let's talk a little bit about subscriptions. If you click on this tab right here, you can create a new subscription by clicking there. And it's going to ask you to choose a method of delivery. In our case, we only have one option, which is a Windows file share. If you've configured your email settings, then you'll have a second option in there, which is report server email. Okay, and so you're going to give your file a file name and make sure you say add a file extension when a file is created. Under the render format, we have several different formats here. So if you choose XML, then the extension will be .xml. So with the subscription, you're going to have a report automatically be run, and that report will go into a directory that you specify. Before you specify your path right here, you do need to make sure you get on the local directory system and specify a directory and make sure that it's shared. So if I show you my C drive right here, you see that I created a folder called My Reports, and according to this icon, it's shared. How do you share a folder? Well, you simply right-click on it and click on Share. And then you specify what the share name is. And then you can also specify the permission levels. So the syntax for that path is the server name followed by the folder name or the share name. So there's My Reports, and I'm going to have the render format be as XML. The credentials used to access the file share, I'm going to make this be Julie1Julie. Once again, it's the domain name followed by the username, and I'm going to use the password. Now we have three choices for the overwrite option. You can just say, hey, if the file already exists, if that report already exists, then overwrite the existing file with the newer version. Or we can say do not overwrite if the previous version exists. Or we can say increment the file names as newer versions are added. I'm going to choose that third option. Now I scroll down and I specify the schedule. The time on my system happens to be 7:06, so I'm going to make this be a couple minutes later. I'm going to say select schedule, and I'll just say run this every weekday at 7:08, just so we can see the output. And you can also specify the end date if you want to. I'm going to hit OK, and I need to put this password right in there again, and then hit OK again, and we'll just wait a couple minutes for the report to run. So here we see the report here, and the last run is not showing up with a timestamp yet because it hasn't been run yet. Okay, it's 7:08 now, so I'm just going to hit the refresh button right here. And you'll see here that we have a timestamp for the last run, and it tells us the status. So if there was an error writing to that directory, it would let you know that it had an issue writing to it. Okay, so there's the status. We can always click on Edit to modify, the subscription runtime. And like I mentioned earlier, we can also delete our subscriptions if we want to. And just to ensure that our report ran correctly, we're going to go to our Windows Explorer right here and click on My Reports, and there is our report. Just double click on that, and there is our XML document. Now back to our report manager. If we go to Home right here, you'll see that there's this link called Report Builder. Now the end user is going to see this link if they belong to a role that has the Report Builder privileges. So you'll see that when we click on Report Builder, we'll get a nice little splash page, and here we have the SQL Server Report Builder right here. Now in order to use Report Builder, you have to have a source of data. When you initially open yours, you're probably not going to see anything right there. The reason why I see this there is because earlier I already created a report model. So in order to use this, you have to first of all create a report model. So we're going to go to our Business Intelligence Development Studio first and create just that. Here's my Business Intelligence Development Studio, and we're going to say New Project, and make sure you say Report Model Project. You can call it anything you want. I just stuck with the default. And you're going to create a data source, then a data source view, and then a report model and publish it. So let's right-click on our data source, and here's our data connection, and we'll hit Next. You can stick with the default if you want to, or you can call it something else, for example, my data source. And now we are going to create a data source view. I'm going to click Next right here, and then we choose which tables we want to provide. So here we have our customer table. I'm also interested in geography as well as fact internet sales. And then we hit Next. And I'll call this my data source view, and then hit Finish. And now we're going to create a report model. So let's right-click on here, add a report model. We can go through this nice little wizard. Here's the data source view we're dealing with. And then we determine the report model generation rules. You're usually safe with just choosing all of these. If you're not interested in displaying aggregate information, you can uncheck that, and so on. So let's just stick with the default values and hit Next. We're going to update the model statistics before generating. Typically you choose that first option if the data source view has been modified. Okay, so we're going to hit Next, and then here is the name. I'm going to call this Customer Report Model, and then we hit Run. This might take a few seconds because it's processing all of the data, and then eventually all of that data will become available to the end users, and then they can dynamically build the report that they want. And eventually you get the Finish button right there. And then the file has been modified outside the source editor. Do you want to reload it? Just say yes to all. So this just gives us a brief synopsis of what is in our report model. And now we can go ahead and publish this. Before we publish it though, I want you to right-click on here, go to Properties, and make sure that you have the appropriate target server URL. So remember in our case, it's port 8079. If you're using port 80, then don't mess with that at all because that's the default port. Okay, so now I'm going to go up to Build, and we're going to deploy it. Eventually we'll see the deployment status right down here. Okay, it succeeded. So now we can move this out of the way, and now we can click on Report Builder again, and it's going to launch, and we should see it as published. Let me move this down here a little bit. And you'll see now that we have our customer report model right here. So make sure that is highlighted. You can move this over here a little bit. And we're going to create a table report. So just make sure that's clicked and then hit OK. And from here you can change the title. So here I'm just going to say Customer by Region Report. And we can drag and drop column fields that we're interested in. So I'm going to click on Geography right here. I'm interested in the English country region name, as well as, let's go to our customers here, we're interested in the total yearly income, and I'm also interested in the average yearly income. You can change these titles right here to something else if you want to. For example, I want to spell out the word average. And there we go. If you want to get rid of these boxes, you can just right-click, or if you want to do formatting, you can do that as well. I'm going to format these to be currencies. So I'll check that. You'll see that the format is changing here a little bit. Almost finished. One more field here. And now let's go ahead and view our report. We run it. And there's our report right there. And at this point, if you want to print things out, if you hover over this icon, that's the print layout, and then you can print it by clicking on that icon right there. Also, if you want to save this as a file, you can just go up here and say File, Save As, and you can save it wherever you want to. Here we are again at the Reporting Services Configuration Manager. There are a couple more options that I want to discuss with you, and so if you're not already at this window, go ahead and launch it by going to your SQL Server menu from your program files and launch this. Okay, so once you've logged in, I want you to go down to your encryption keys. Encryption keys are used to store connection strings, any kind of sensitive data, and credentials. Anytime you're migrating a report server database from one place to another, you're going to have to restore the key. So it's really important that you keep a backup of your key and you know where it is stored. So how do you back it up? Well, you simply click on this button right here and you specify the file location where you want it stored. Make sure it's a place that you can remember. I'm just going to put mine under my Documents directory. So I'll just call this my SSRS key. And then we need to give a password. Make sure you give the same password twice and then hit OK. So now it's backed up. So in case we need to restore, we remember where it is. So under what circumstances would you want to restore? Well, for example, if the hardware goes bad on your system and you need to reinstall reporting services, you definitely need to restore. Or if you want to migrate your reporting services database somewhere else, you'll have to restore that as well. And then there's another option to change your encryption key by clicking on this button. So that's going to update your encryption key with the newer version. If you have a lot of encrypted information, then this operation can take a while. And then the last option here is delete encrypted content. This is not used very often, but it is an option. If you do delete your encrypted content, all of the encrypted information will be deleted, so you'll have to recreate all of those sources, anything that deals with credentials. So let's just go over a scenario where you need to move your reporting services database and service to another machine. Well, first of all, on the old machine, the current machine, you want to make a backup of your encryption key. Then on the destination machine, you go ahead and install reporting services. Then go ahead and shut down the service because you're going to copy the whole database from your source to the destination. When you're finished with that, then you can go ahead and start up your services and then restore the key and you're finished. Now let's talk a little bit about your reporting services farm. If you need to scale out your deployment, here's this right here. And you'll see here that you have a list of servers in your farm. Well, in my case, I don't have a farm, it's just a standalone. But if I wanted to scale this out, I need to make sure that I just have one database, which is the reporting service database. And then I'll have multiple machines that each have a reporting service on it. And really all you need to do is insert the installation disk, run setup.exe like you would normally do, go through the wizard, and when it asks you which database you want to use, instead of specifying a new database, have it point to the existing database on a different server. As soon as you add nodes to your farm, then you can manage the individual nodes by scrolling down here and removing a server or adding a server. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is managing your reporting services through web services. A web service is simply an interface that's accessible through any programming language. So the purpose of managing reporting services through a web service is that I can have any programming language I want. It might be in Java or in Perl, and I can utilize that web service interface to then manage the reporting services database. Well, from the reporting services end, I don't need to do anything special. There's already what we call an endpoint, which is the public interface to the outside world. It's called a Web Services Description Language, and it's a URL that users can access, usually through a web browser. Let me show you an example by dragging over my web browser right now and take a look at my URL. I have my host name that my reporting service is running on and the appropriate port number, and then we have our report server. We accessed that URL earlier. What's special about this is tagged onto the end is report service 2005.asmx WSDL. It stands for Web Service Description Language. And really it's just an XML document that gives us metadata about the web service interface. I usually like to read these from the bottom up. So you'll see here that the web service address is that address right up here. And then as we scroll our way up, you'll see that there are several tags that say operation. So there's several operations available. There's regenerate model, generate model, that's for report models, list model, drill through reports, and so on. There's many different operations available to us. And so what I would do is, let's say I had a Java program and I wanted to use Java to manage report server. Well, there are tools in Java that allow us to take a WSDL document and then generate stub code. And that's just what we would do. We would provide the Java program with this WSDL document, and the Java tool would do the rest for us. We would just need to plug in the appropriate values, such as authentication credentials. Now, as far as knowing the details of the nuts and bolts of what's going on behind the scenes on the report server end, the end user doesn't have to know any of that. All they have to know is the general WSDL information. It's kind of like a black box. They see what's on the outside, but they can't see anything on the inside. Now, if you want to get more information about web services and web service description language, you can always go to www.w3.org, and they have the full specifications posted on their website. Let's review what we learned in this nugget. We first of all talked about the report server configuration. You're going to need to make sure that you have the IIS service up and running, and also note which port it's running on, because you're going to have to specify that port within the report service configuration. You can access the report manager through a URL, and you can also get a list of the published reports from a separate URL. Make sure to grant users privileges to access the reports and the report items through the roles that we mentioned. As far as deployment, from within your Business Intelligence Development Studio, go to the properties of your report and make sure that the port number is specified properly. We talked about our report builder. Remember, you're going to have to create report models which configure data sets, and that allows the end users to create their own reports. We talked about web farms. You can have multiple report servers tapping into one report server database. To install a node onto your report farm, you simply go through the setup installation and make sure you specify the appropriate report server database when it asks you. And then we also talked about key management. You're going to have to restore keys whenever you have to migrate a reporting service database, or if the server goes bad and you need to reinstall the reporting service. Well, I hope this has been informative, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.